Good evening. Tonight we wade into the gritty, the uncertain, and the not-so-glorious side of history. Behind the grand palaces and naval triumphs lies a far harsher reality, one that smelled of sweet smoke and slow decay. To live it, honestly, was exhausting. It was a battle fought not on a field but in the mind. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Before it had a name, it was simply a flower, a wild and delicate thing, pushing its head through the stony soil of the Mediterranean coast, its petals a papery whisper of white or pink or a deep bruised purple. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy, a name it would earn 1,000 times over. Long before there were empires to paralyze, there were scattered bands of humans, their knuckles still raw from the invention of the stone axe, their minds just beginning to knit together the complex tapestry of agriculture. Sometime around the 6th millennium BCE, in the soft earth of the Fertile Crescent, these Neolithic farmers, our distant weary ancestors, noticed this particular flower. Perhaps they saw the way animals would chew on the unripe seed pods and then grow placid, their anxieties about predators and starvation melting away into a profound indifference. Or perhaps a curious child seeking a snack broke open a green pod and licked the bitter, milky sap that oozed from the wound. However it happened, the discovery was a quiet revolution. They learned to cultivate it, to select for the plants with the fattest pods, the ones that wept the most potent tears. They learned the simple, elegant art of its harvest. After the vibrant petals fell away, leaving the swollen, blue-green capsule crowned like a tiny king, they would wait for the perfect moment just before the pod ripened. Then, with a sharp flake of flint or a carefully honed bone knife, they would make a series of shallow, precise cuts into the skin. Almost immediately, a thick white latex would begin to bleed, beading up on the surface. Exposed to the air, it would slowly oxidize, darkening into a sticky, brownish-black gum. This was the raw material of dreams. This was opium. They would scrape it off, roll it into balls or cakes and store it, a treasure more valuable than any polished stone. Archaeological digs in the lake dwellings of Neolithic Switzerland have unearthed poppy seeds by the thousand, remnants of a Stone Age larder, suggesting that this plant was not just known, but systematically farmed. It was a staple. From these humble agrarian beginnings, the poppy began its inexorable march into the heart of civilization. In the sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Sumerians, the very architects of the written word, cultivated the flower with a reverence bordering on worship. On their clay cuneiform tablets, etched around 3400 BCE, they gave it a name that sings with a kind of innocent wonder: Lgil, the joy plant. For them, it was a gift from the gods, a direct line to the divine. Priests would administer it during sacred rituals, a smoky incense to carry prayers upward, a draught to open the mind to divine whispers. It was a tool to soothe the existential dread of a people living at the mercy of flooding rivers and capricious deities. It eased the pain of childbirth, quieted the cough of the dying, and offered a fleeting, blissful escape from the harshness of Bronze Age life. The joy plant was woven into the very fabric of their society, a sacred medicine and a holy sacrament. The knowledge, like the rivers, flowed downstream to Egypt. The great physicians of the New Kingdom, who compiled their wisdom onto the sprawling Ebers papyrus around 1550 BCE, were well acquainted with the poppy's power. They prescribed opium with clinical precision. It was a key ingredient in remedies to treat eye ailments, to bind the bowels, and, in a prescription of chilling practicality, to stop the excessive crying of children. Imagine a mother in ancient Thebes, her child wailing with colic or teething pain, administering a small dose of this potent medicine, bringing a blessed, unnatural silence to her home. The city of Thebes itself became a centre of poppy cultivation, its fields, known as the Thebaicum, producing a high-quality opium that was traded across the known world. It was packed into amphorae, loaded onto Phoenician trading ships, and sent sailing across the glittering expanse of the Mediterranean. It was not merely a commodity, it was an extension of Egyptian influence, a soft power that could quiet a king's toothache or ensure a restless aristocrat's sleep. The poppy found a particularly welcome home among the civilizations of the Aegean. On the island of Crete, the vibrant Minoan culture, which flourished 2,000 years before Christ, seems to have placed the poppy at the very centre of its spiritual world. Archaeologists there unearthed a small terracotta figurine, a goddess or a priestess, her eyes wide and staring, her hands raised in benediction. And piercing her diadem like divine antennae are 3 opium poppy capsules, their notched crowns unmistakable. She is the poppy goddess, a deity of sleep, of dreams, of the gentle passage from this world to the next. The poppy was not just a plant, it was an incarnation of the divine feminine, a source of healing and oblivion. On the Greek mainland, its presence was more complicated, a substance both celebrated and feared. Homer, the great blind poet, speaks in the Odyssey of a mysterious drug called nepenthe. Given to a grieving Telemachus by Helen of Troy, it was a substance that banishes all pain and sorrow and brings forgetfulness of every evil. Scholars have long debated the identity of nepenthe, but most agree he was describing an opium-laced wine, a draught to make the horrors of war and the agony of loss simply fade away. Later, the father of medicine himself, Hippocrates, approached opium with a physician's caution but undeniable respect. Writing in the 4th century BCE, he dismissed the magical thinking surrounding the plant and instead catalogued its practical uses as a hypnotic, a narcotic, and a styptic. He recommended it for internal diseases and uterine ailments, recognizing its immense therapeutic value. But even as Hippocrates was medicalizing opium, it retained its mystical aura. It was almost certainly used in the secretive Eleusinian mysteries, the most sacred initiation rites in ancient Greece, where participants sought direct, ecstatic communion with the goddesses Demeter and Persephone. A drink called the Kion was consumed, and while its exact recipe is lost to time, many believe that a mild dose of opium was the key ingredient, helping to induce the profound visions and spiritual revelations that were the ceremony's hallmark. The Greeks understood opium's duality. It could be a precise medical tool in the hands of a physician, or a key to unlocking the doors of perception in the hands of a priest. When Rome conquered Greece, it absorbed not just its territories, but its gods, its philosophies, and its pharmacy. The Romans, with their genius for organization and logistics, took the cultivation and trade of opium to an entirely new scale. It was no longer a rare import or a temple secret. Opium was a staple of Roman life. The great physician Galen of Pergamon, who served Roman emperors in the 2nd century AD, wrote more extensively about opium than any before him. He praised it as the most powerful of all analgesics, a remedy for poisons and for venomous bites, for headache, vertigo, deafness, epilepsy, apoplexy, dimness of sight, loss of voice. The list went on and on. He perfected complex medicinal concoctions called theriacs, legendary cure-alls in which opium was the essential, indispensable ingredient. These were sold in apothecary shops throughout the empire. Citizens from senators to legionaries could purchase it to ease their ailments, to secure a night's rest, or simply to escape the noise and squalor of the city. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher-emperor, was a regular user, taking a small dose each evening to soothe the chronic pains that plagued him. Under the Romans, the joy plant completed its first great transformation. From a sacred flower to a physician's tool to a common, everyday commodity. A comfort for the masses, a habit for the powerful, and a business for the empire. Its journey, however, was only just beginning. With the slow, shuddering collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the great libraries of classical knowledge were scattered, burned, or left to rot. The intricate medical wisdom of figures like Galen became a ghost in Europe, a garbled memory preserved in isolated monasteries. The intricate supply chains that had brought high-quality opium from Egypt and Asia Minor fell apart. The West entered a period of medical stagnation, but the flame of knowledge was not extinguished. It was merely carried eastward to a new and brilliant civilization that was rising from the sands of Arabia. The Islamic Golden Age, from the 8th to the 14th centuries, became the custodian of antiquity's wisdom. In Baghdad's magnificent House of Wisdom, a great translation movement was underway. Arab, Persian, and Syriac scholars worked tirelessly translating the Greek texts of Hippocrates, Dioscorides, and Galen into Arabic, saving them from oblivion. They did not, however, simply preserve this knowledge. They interrogated it, refined it, and expanded upon it in ways the Greeks and Romans could have scarcely imagined. Islamic physicians, with their advanced understanding of chemistry and botany, subjected opium to rigorous scientific study. They were masters of pharmacology. The Persian polymath Al-Kindi wrote treatises on the specific dosages required for analgesia. The brilliant clinician Rhazes, or Al-Razi, chief physician at Baghdad's great hospital, pioneered the use of opium as an anesthetic, developing sponges soaked in a mixture of opium, henbane and mandrake. Patients would inhale the vapours, falling into a deep slumber that allowed surgeons to perform procedures that would have been impossible on a conscious screaming patient. This was a monumental leap forward in the history of medicine. But the most towering figure of this era, the man whose work would define medicine for the next 600 years, was the Persian scholar Ibn Sina, known to the West as Avicenna. His encyclopedic work, The Canon of Medicine, completed around 1025, was a breathtaking synthesis of all known medical knowledge. Within its pages, Avicenna provided the most detailed and sophisticated analysis of opium to date. He meticulously catalogued its virtues, recommending it for the treatment of pain, diarrhea, and coughs, noting its specific efficacy in treating meningitis. He was a champion of its therapeutic power, describing it as the most potent of all sleeping aids. But Avicenna was also a clear-eyed scientist. He was among the first to systematically document opium's dark side. He warned, with stark clarity, of its potential for lethargy, for mental impairment, for the suppression of breath, and for death by overdose. Most presciently, he recognized and described its capacity for addiction, the terrible craving that it could instill in those who used it unwisely. His canon was a masterwork of balanced empirical observation, a book that would become the standard medical text not only in the Islamic world, but, once translated back into Latin, in the universities of medieval Europe as well. While the scholars of Baghdad and Cordoba were refining the science of opium, Arab traders, the undisputed masters of the long-distance caravan, were spreading the substance itself. Opium, pressed into dark, dense cakes, became a precious cargo on the legendary Silk Road. Imagine the slow swaying gait of a camel train, bells tinkling softly in the vast, silent expense of the Central Asian steppe. In their packs, alongside bolts of silk, sacks of fragrant spices, and chests of shimmering glass, were these bricks of dried poppy juice. They travelled from the Levant and Persia through treacherous mountain passes and across scorching deserts, stopping at the bustling caravanserai of Samarkand and Bukhara. The Silk Road was not merely a conduit for goods, it was an artery for culture, for ideas, and for pharmacology. And it was this route that carried opium on the next great leg of its journey, to India. In the warm, fertile lands of the Indian subcontinent, the poppy found a second home. The climate was ideal for its cultivation, and soon vast fields of white and purple flowers were blooming under the Indian sun. The substance was readily incorporated into the ancient traditions of Ayurvedic medicine, but it also found a place in the culture of the Mughal Empire, which rose to power in the 16th century. The Mughal emperors and their courtiers embraced opium, not just as a medicine, but as a refined luxury, a tool for contemplation and pleasure. They did not smoke it, but rather consumed it in a drink called doda, or ground it into a fine powder and ate it. For the ruling class, it was a way to enhance poetic inspiration, to endure the tediousness of court ceremony, or simply to drift into a state of serene detachment. The Emperor Akbar the Great regulated its sale through state-licensed shops, while his son Jahangir was a notorious and near-crippled addict. Under Mughal patronage, India became a major centre for opium production, rivaling even the traditional fields of Anatolia and Egypt. The supply was now immense, the quality superb, and its reach was about to extend even further east, to the shores of the largest and proudest empire on earth. Arab and later Portuguese traders sailing the maritime trade routes were the first to bring opium to the ports of Ming Dynasty China. For centuries it remained a foreign curiosity, an exotic and fantastically expensive medicine imported in small quantities. It was known as Yapian or Ofuyung, transliterations of its foreign name. Chinese medical texts from the Tang and Song dynasties mention it as a treatment for dysentery and other ailments, a powerful but rare tool in the physician's arsenal. The Chinese preferred to eat it, often mixed with honey or dissolved in wine, just as the Mughals did. In this form, its effects were slow to take hold, the euphoria was mild, and while addiction was certainly possible, it was a gradual and less compulsive process. For the educated elite of the Ming and early Qing dynasties, opium was a rare indulgence, a status symbol, a powerful sleeping draught for the weary scholar or aging official. It was a marginal substance in a vast and self-sufficient empire. It posed no threat. No one could have predicted the alchemical reaction that was about to occur, a reaction that would transform this physician's panacea into a social poison of unparalleled destructive power. The catalyst for this transformation would come not from China, but from halfway around the world, from the newly discovered Americas. It was tobacco. The introduction of tobacco to China by Spanish and Portuguese sailors in the late 16th and early 17th centuries sparked a nationwide craze. The Chinese people took to smoking with an enthusiasm that startled foreign observers. The practice spread like wildfire, from the southern ports to the imperial court in Beijing. Alarmed by this new vice and its perceived health effects, the last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, issued an edict in 1639 banning the sale and consumption of tobacco. It was a classic, well-intentioned act of prohibition, and like so many that would follow it in history, it backfired spectacularly. The demand for tobacco did not disappear, it merely went underground, and in the process, it spurred a fateful innovation. Merchants seeking ways to disguise their illicit product or to stretch their supply began mixing the tobacco with other substances. They tried arsenic, they tried hemp, but the mixture that proved most popular, most potent, and most profitable was tobacco blended with opium. This new concoction was called madak. This was the critical world-altering development. The shift from eating opium to smoking it changed everything. When opium is ingested, it is processed slowly by the digestive system and the liver, and only a fraction of its psychoactive alkaloids reach the brain over a prolonged period. When it is smoked, however, the vapour is absorbed directly into the bloodstream through the vast surface area of the lungs. The alkaloids bypass the liver and cross the blood-brain barrier in a matter of seconds. The result was a sudden, intense and overwhelming wave of euphoria, a rush far more powerful and far more compelling than anything that could be achieved by eating the drug. This method maximised the drug's addictive potential, forging a neurological prison from which escape was agonisingly difficult. Madak became a sensation, and the government's attempts to suppress it were futile. The practice spread from the coastal province of Fujian and the island of Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, inland, following the rivers and trade routes into the heart of the empire. By the early 18th century, the innovation had been perfected. The tobacco was increasingly seen as an unnecessary adulterant. Devotees discovered that by preparing the raw opium, boiling it, skimming the impurities and reducing it to a thick, treacly paste called chandu, it could be smoked pure. This required a whole new set of rituals and paraphernalia. The simple tobacco pipe was replaced by a specialized instrument, a long tube, often made of bamboo or ivory, with a ceramic or earthenware bowl attached to its side. The smoker would not light the opium directly. Instead, a tiny pill of chandu would be picked up on the end of a long needle, heated over the flame of a special oil lamp until it sizzled and swelled, and then deftly inserted into the small hole in the pipe bowl. The user would then lie on their side, hold the bowl over the lamp, and inhale the thick, sweet-smelling vapour in long, slow breaths. This ritualised process gave rise to a new social institution, the opium den. These were not the sordid, chaotic places of later Western caricature. In the 18th century they were often calm, quiet, almost meditative establishments. Patrons would recline on shared platforms, their heads resting on porcelain or wooden pillows, the only sound the soft bubbling of the pipes and the gentle hiss of the lamps. Here, time itself seemed to slow down. Conversations were muted and philosophical. Worries about harvests, debts, or family obligations dissolved in the fragrant haze. For a few hours, a person could become a detached observer of their own life, wrapped in a blanket of profound contentment and blissful apathy. It was an escape, and it was seductive beyond measure. What began as a habit of sailors and dock workers in the southern ports soon crept up the social ladder. Soldiers smoked it to ward off boredom and fear. Merchants and officials used it to grease the wheels of business and bureaucracy, conducting negotiations in the hazy calm of the den. Scholars and poets smoked it in search of inspiration, finding that it untethered their minds from the rigid constraints of classical convention. By the middle of the 18th century, the problem had become impossible for the Qing government to ignore. Addiction, once a rare affliction of the wealthy, was now a visible epidemic, spreading through every level of society. It was sapping the ambition of the brightest scholars, draining the coffers of rich merchant families, and corrupting the officials sent to enforce the law. The lethargy it induced was seen as a direct threat to the Confucian values of hard work, filial piety, and social responsibility that formed the bedrock of the Qing state. The Emperor Yongzheng, a stern and diligent ruler, was the first to recognize the existential threat. In 1729 he issued the first imperial edict specifically targeting opium, banning its recreational sale and the operation of opium dens. The penalty for transgression was severe: strangulation for sellers and the kang, a heavy wooden collar for users, but the law was a blunt instrument against a problem so deeply intertwined with pleasure, profit and corruption. The trade was simply too lucrative. Local magistrates and officials, paid a pittance by the imperial treasury, found that turning a blind eye or actively facilitating the smuggling of opium was a far easier path to wealth. The edict drove the trade further into the shadows, creating a vast and sophisticated black market. Smugglers used fast boats, known as fast crabs and scrambling dragons, to outrun customs junks along the coast. The opium was hidden in legitimate cargo, and a complex network of secret societies and corrupt officials ensured its distribution throughout the empire. The demand was insatiable, and for now the supply was largely domestic, supplemented by a steady but manageable trickle of imports from India. China had a festering wound, a homegrown crisis of addiction that was slowly paralysing its people, but the wound was about to be torn open. On the horizon, the sails of a new kind of trader were appearing, the British East India Company, and they were not bringing opium by the chest, but by the shipload. The quiet, creeping sickness was about to become a raging, foreign-fueled plague. The problem was silver, a simple, elegant, and utterly ruinous problem. For decades, the British Empire, and specifically its most powerful corporate entity, the British East India Company, had developed an insatiable thirst for Chinese goods. Tea, primarily. Crates upon crates of it, filling the holds of the ships making the long, treacherous journey around Africa and across the Indian Ocean. But also silk, so fine it felt like captured air. and porcelain so delicate it seemed to have been fired in a dragon's breath. London and all of Europe clamoured for these things. The Qing dynasty, serene and self-sufficient in its ancient rhythms, wanted almost nothing in return. They had no need for Britain's heavy woolen cloth or its crude metal trinkets. The workshops of the world at this moment in history were in China, and so for every chest of tea that landed in London's docks, a chest of silver had to sail out to Canton. The drain was immense, a hemorrhage of bullion that threatened the economic stability of the British Empire. A solution was needed, not a diplomatic one, but a commercial one, a new product, something the Chinese did not know they needed, but soon would not be able to live without. And there, in the fertile fields of Bengal, under the hot, hazy Indian sun, the solution was growing. Poppies, acres and acres of them. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company had ceased to be a mere trading firm and had become a territorial ruler, the de facto sovereign of Bengal. With this power came control over the region's prime agricultural lands, the perfect soil for cultivating Papaver somniferum. The company, a marvel of bureaucratic efficiency, established a complete monopoly. It wasn't a free market, it was a command economy built around a single narcotic commodity. Two agencies, one in Patna and one in Benares, oversaw the entire operation. Company agents would advance cash to local farmers, compelling them to grow poppies instead of food. It was a subtle form of debt peonage. Once in the system, it was nearly impossible to get out. At harvest time, the raw, sticky opium latex was scraped from the poppy pods and delivered to the company's factories. Here it was refined, tested for purity, and pressed into dense, cannonball-sized cakes, each weighing about 3 pounds. These cakes were then carefully packed with poppy petals into heavy wooden chests, each designed to hold 40 cakes, a standardized unit of global trade. The final product was a high-grade, reliable, and exceptionally potent form of opium known as Patna, or Malwa, a brand name as recognisable in the dens of Canton as any English tea was in the drawing rooms of Bath. The company, ever mindful of its public image and its royal charter, maintained a careful fiction, did not, officially, sell opium to China. Such a thing would be unseemly and, more importantly, illegal under Chinese law. Instead, they held grand auctions in Calcutta. The scene was one of sober commerce. Men in fine suits bidding on thousands of chests, the air thick with the scent of tobacco and money, the auctioneer's voice a steady drone marking the transfer of this immense quantity of processed narcotic. The buyers were not company men. They were the country traders, private British, American and Parsi merchants running fleets of fast, nimble ships called clippers. These traders, men like William Jardine and James Matheson, would purchase the opium with credit, load it onto their ships, and sail for the Chinese coast. They were the deniable middlemen, the unofficial distribution arm of the company's vast production machine. The East India Company simply produced the drug and sold it at the warehouse door. What happened next was officially not their concern, and with the proceeds from these auctions, the company would then buy tea in Canton, finally closing the loop. The silver was no longer flowing out of London. It was flowing out of China into the pockets of the country traders, who used it to buy tea, which then generated profits for the company in London. It was a perfect, closed and utterly devastating triangle of trade. The corporate engine was humming, and its fuel was addiction. For the Daoguang Emperor, ruling from the silent, sprawling expanse of the Forbidden City in Beijing, the reports from the south were a litany of decay. The problem was no longer just economic, though the silver drain was now reversing, bleeding the empire's treasury dry and destabilizing the currency. The problem was moral, a spiritual sickness that was hollowing out his kingdom from within. From the lowest peasant to the highest court official, even among the elite Manchu bannermen who formed the core of his army, the pipe had become master. Productivity collapsed. The social fabric frayed. Imperial edicts forbidding the trade had been issued for decades, but they were toothless. easily circumvented by a network of corrupt local officials in Canton who grew rich on bribes from the foreign smugglers. The emperor and his court debated the issue endlessly. Some argue for legalization and taxation, a pragmatic approach to control the trade and at least profit from the vice. Others, a faction of hardliners, demanded complete eradication. The nation's soul, they argued, was at stake. In 1838, the emperor made his choice. He sided with the hardliners and summoned a man renowned throughout the empire for his brilliance, his efficiency, and his absolute unwavering moral integrity. His name was Lin Zexu. A veteran administrator and scholar of the highest caliber, Lin was seen as incorruptible, a force of Confucian righteousness in a corrupted age. The emperor appointed him imperial high commissioner, granting him extraordinary powers to travel to Canton and extinguish the opium trade by any means necessary. When Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in early 1839, he was not like the other officials the foreign traders were used to dealing with. He did not want their bribes, he did not engage in their pleasantries or their delaying tactics. He was a man on a holy mission. His first actions were not directed at the foreigners, but at his own people. He arrested over 1,600 Chinese dealers and users, shutting down the local distribution networks. He established clinics for addicts. He conducted a brilliant public information campaign, posting notices and proclamations explaining the evils of the drug. He even wrote a long, eloquent letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her on a moral level, sovereign to sovereign. "Where is your conscience?" he asked. Suppose there were people from another country who carried opium for sale to England and seduced your people into buying and smoking it. You, the sovereign of your honourable country, will not only not permit it to be manufactured and sold, but will also seize and destroy it. The letter, of course, was never delivered. It was lost in the bureaucratic channels of London. Having cleaned his own house, Lin turned his gaze to the foreign merchants huddled in their small enclave on the waterfront, the 13 factories. He was methodical. He first demanded that they surrender all of their opium, every last chest, not just on their ships in the harbour, but in their floating warehouses anchored at Linton Island in the Pearl River Delta. The British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, a conflicted and weary naval officer, offered a token surrender of 1,000 chests. Lin Zexu laughed at the offer. He was not negotiating, he was issuing a decree. When the merchants refused to comply, Lin acted with quiet, calculated force. He surrounded the 13 factories with Chinese troops. He blockaded the river. He removed all Chinese servants, cooks, and labourers from the compound, cutting off food and water supplies. The several hundred foreigners, accustomed to a life of luxury and command, were now prisoners in their own opulent ghetto. The psychological pressure mounted day by day. Elliot, trapped with his countrymen, found himself in an impossible position. He was responsible for their lives, but also for British property. In a fateful decision, he broke the impasse. He ordered the British merchants to surrender all of their opium, and he did so with a crucial promise: the British government would cover all their losses. With this single stroke, he transformed a dispute over private illegal contraband into a matter of state. A corporate liability became a national debt. He was in effect writing a cheque that could only be cashed by the Royal Navy. Over the next 6 weeks, the handover took place. Chest after heavy wooden chest was brought ashore. The final tally was staggering. 20 Su-83 chests of opium, representing over 1,200 tons of the drug, with a market value of over £2 million sterling, an astronomical sum. Lin Zexu had won. He now had the poison that had been plaguing China. He could have simply stored it or sold it himself. Instead, he chose to make a statement, a grand act of symbolic purification for the entire world to see. On the beach at Humen, he ordered 3 massive trenches dug and lined with stone and timber. Workers broke open the chests, dumping the dark, sticky balls of opium into the pits. They then added salt and lime and flooded the trenches with seawater, creating a churning, noxious slurry. For 23 days, under the watchful eyes of officials and curious onlookers, the sludge was stirred by labourers before being sluiced out into the South China Sea. Lin had made his point. He had faced down the foreign barbarians, confiscated their poison, and cleansed the shores of the celestial kingdom. He had upheld the law and the moral authority of the emperor, but back in London, news of the imprisonment of British subjects and the destruction of British property was being spun into a narrative of national humiliation. The merchants, led by Jardine and Matheson, who had hurried back to England, lobbied Parliament relentlessly. They weren't drug dealers, they were respectable merchants, they claimed, whose property had been stolen by a tyrannical, uncivilized government. The debate was framed not around the morality of the opium trade, that was barely mentioned, but around the principles of free trade, national honour, and the need to teach the insolent Chinese a lesson. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, a man who saw the world as a chessboard for British interests, argued forcefully for war, and so an expeditionary force was dispatched, not to negotiate but to punish. A fleet of warships and transports carrying 4,000 soldiers set sail for the coast of China. The sound they would make upon arrival was not the quiet exchange of silver for tea, but the roar of cannon fire. The First Opium War was not a contest of equals. It was a collision between two different centuries. The Qing dynasty possessed a massive army, but it was a pre-industrial force. Its soldiers were armed with matchlock muskets, spears and bows. Its navy consisted of wooden war junks, designed for fighting pirates in coastal waters, propelled by sail and oar. Its strategy was based on fixed fortifications, on the idea that an enemy would attack a specific point which could be defended. The British, on the other hand, brought the full weight of the Industrial Revolution to bear. Their infantry carried percussion-capped muskets that could fire in the rain. Their artillery was vastly superior in range and accuracy, but their most decisive weapon was not a soldier or a cannon, but a ship. Specifically a new kind of ship, powered not by the wind, but by steam. The most famous of these was a privately owned vessel chartered by the East India Company, a ship that came to symbolize the entire conflict, the Nemesis. It was not large or beautiful. It was a flat-bottomed, iron-hulled paddle steamer. Its shallow draft, less than 2 meters, meant it could ignore coastal fortifications and sail up rivers deep into the Chinese heartland, where no deep-hulled Qing war junk could pursue. Its iron hull made it largely impervious to the shot from Chinese cannons. It could move against the wind and tide, appearing where it was least expected, a mobile artillery platform of terrifying efficiency. The war began in earnest in mid-1840, not with a grand battle, but with a series of surgical, overwhelming strikes. The British fleet, under the command of Admiral George Eliot, Charles Eliot's cousin, bypassed the heavily defended port of Canton altogether, a move that baffled the Chinese commanders. Their strategy was not to capture one port, it was to paralyze the entire empire. They seized the island of Chusan, establishing a northern base. Then they systematically dismantled the defences of the Pearl River Delta. The Bogue forts, which guarded the approach to Canton, were formidable stone structures, but they were designed to fire out to sea. The Nemesis and other steamships simply steamed past them, landed troops behind them, and captured them from the rear. The technological gap was a chasm. In one engagement, a fleet of 15 war junks bravely engaged a single British steamer. The junk's cannonballs bounced harmlessly off the iron hull, while the steamer's swivelling gun picked them off one by one with explosive shells, technology the Chinese had never encountered. The most devastating phase of the war began when the British decided to strike at the economic jugular of the Qing Empire, the Yangtze River. In the summer of 1842, a British fleet of over 70 ships, including several steamers, pushed its way up the Great River. This was a strategic masterstroke. The Yangtze was the main artery of commerce in China, and more importantly, it was intersected by the Grand Canal, the system that transported vital grain and rice from the fertile south to the capital, Beijing, in the north. By capturing the city of Zhenjiang, where the Grand Canal met the Yangtze, the British could effectively starve the capital into submission. The battle for Zhenjiang was one of the most brutal of the war. The Manchu garrison there, knowing the strategic importance of the city, fought with desperate courage. Unlike other Qing forces that had often broken and run in the face of British firepower, the Manchus in Zhenjiang fought street by street, house by house. But courage was no match for technology. The British forces, with their superior discipline and weaponry, eventually took the city. The Manchu general, seeing that all was lost, calmly walked back to his headquarters, sat on his chair, and ordered his servants to set the building on fire, immolating himself in the final act of defiance. The fall of Zhenjiang broke the will of the Daoguang emperor. With his capital cut off from its food supply and the British fleet threatening to sail on to Nanjing, the ancient southern capital, he had no choice but to sue for peace. The war, which had begun over chests of opium destroyed on a beach, was over. The gunboats had silenced the imperial edicts, and the poppy smoke rising from 1,000,000 pipes across China was now mixing with the black smoke belching from the funnels of Britain's steam-powered navy. The old world had been shattered, and a new, unequal relationship was about to be dictated, written not in ink, but in the bitter terms of defeat. The guns had fallen silent. The smoke, for now, had cleared from the Pearl River Delta. Aboard the imposing British warship HMS Cornwallis, anchored in the waters of Nanking, a very different kind of ceremony was about to unfold. It was August 29th, 1842. The air was thick and humid, heavy with the stillness that follows a storm. Inside the grand cabin, British officers in their crisp, sweat-dampened uniforms stood with a rigid, almost bored confidence. Their leader, Sir Henry Pottinger, carried the quiet authority of a man who held all the cards, a man who had come not to negotiate but to dictate. Opposite them sat the Qing imperial commissioners, their silk robes seeming to wilt in the oppressive heat. These men, Qiying and Yilibu, were scholars, masters of calligraphy and Confucian classics, men accustomed to a world of subtle gestures and layered meanings. They were now faced with the blunt, brutal arithmetic of defeat. The document that lay between them on the polished table was not a discussion point. It was an invoice for a war China never wanted, fought over a drug Britain insisted on selling. This was the Treaty of Nanking. It was a masterpiece of imperial extraction, written not in the nuanced brushstrokes of diplomacy, but with the sharp, unforgiving point of a bayonet. Each clause was a carefully calibrated humiliation. First, the money. China was to pay a staggering indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, 6 million for the opium that Commissioner Lin had so righteously destroyed, 3 million to settle debts owed by Chinese merchants in Canton to their British counterparts, and a final crushing 12 million, a bill for the entire cost of the war itself. The British had essentially forced China to pay for the very invasion that had brought it to its knees. It was a debt that would cripple the Qing treasury for years, a silver hemorrhage from the heart of the empire. Then came the land. A small, rocky, sparsely inhabited island off the coast was to be ceded to Britain in perpetuity. The British saw it as a deep-water port, a strategic foothold, a warehouse and military base from which to project power and protect their precious trade. To the emperor, it was an insignificant fishing outpost. Its name was Hong Kong, a permanent foreign-owned shard of rock embedded just under the skin of the Celestial Empire, a wound that could never fully close. But the true genius of the treaty, its most devastating and forward-thinking provision, was the dismantling of the old canton system. For centuries, the Qing had carefully managed foreign trade, confining the bothersome barbarians to a small district in a single city, Canton, controlling them through a designated guild of Chinese merchants known as the Cohong. It was a quarantine. The Treaty of Nanking shattered it. 5 new treaty ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo and Shanghai, were to be thrown open to British residents and commerce. This was not merely an expansion of trade, it was a strategic injection of foreign influence directly into the coastal arteries of China. British merchants, missionaries and officials could now live, buy property, and operate under their own rules in these key economic centres. And to ensure they could do so without interference, the treaty introduced the concept of extraterritoriality. A British subject who committed a crime in China would not be subject to Chinese law. They would be tried by their own consular courts under their own laws. The Son of Heaven was no longer the ultimate legal authority in his own domain. China was, in effect, being told that its own system of justice was not good enough to be applied to a European. The Qing officials signed. Their brushes trembled, but they signed. What choice did they have? The Royal Navy sat in their rivers, its guns trained on their cities. This piece of paper was the first of what would become known as the unequal treaties. It set a precedent. It showed the world that the ancient slumbering empire was vulnerable. It was a door kicked open, and soon the Americans, the French, and others would come crowding through, demanding their own treaties, their own ports, their own privileges. The ink on the treaty was barely dry, but it had already drawn a deep and lasting scar across the face of the nation. This was the formal beginning of China's century of humiliation, a long, slow, agonizing twilight from which it would not begin to emerge for 100 years. The peace it purchased was illusory, a fragile quiet built upon resentment and shame, a peace destined not to last. For in the world of empire, an open wound is not an invitation to heal. It is an invitation to press harder. The peace, if one could call it that, was little more than a pause, a moment for the British merchants to count their swelling profits, and for the Qing court to grapple with the dizzying reality of their new powerlessness. The opium trade, the very thing that had started the war, was not even mentioned in the Treaty of Nanking. It was a delicate omission. The British knew it would be unseemly to formally demand the right to sell narcotics, and the Qing were too weak to demand its prohibition. So the trade simply continued. And it grew. It flowed into the newly opened ports, a silver drain that was now a torrent, corrupting officials, addicting millions, and sapping the strength of the nation. The scar of Nanking did not heal. It festered. For some in Britain, the terms of the treaty were not nearly enough. The appetite of the empire was insatiable. They wanted more ports, access to the vast interior of China along the great Yangtze River, a permanent ambassador in the sacred city of Beijing itself. Demand the emperor viewed as an unthinkable violation. They needed a pretext, a reason to finish the job they had started. And in the messy, chaotic world of the Chinese coast, pretexts were cheap. In October of 1856, one arrived in the form of a small vessel called the Arrow. It was a Chinese-owned ship with a Chinese crew that had been temporarily registered in Hong Kong and was very likely involved in a bit of piracy. Chinese officials boarded the ship in Canton and arrested several crew members. The British consul, the famously belligerent Harry Parkes, claimed that Arrow had been flying a British flag and that this was a grave insult to the Crown. The flag was almost certainly not flying at the time, and the ship's registration had expired. It didn't matter. The insult was manufactured, the outrage was performed, and the gunboats were summoned. This time the British would not be alone. The French under Napoleon III were eager to build their own colonial prestige and saw an opportunity. Their pretext was even flimsier, the execution of a French missionary, Auguste Chapdelaine, who had been illegally proselytizing deep in Guangxi province, a region then convulsed by the massive Taiping rebellion. That he was likely caught and killed by local militia rather than on any official imperial order was a detail conveniently ignored. The two great European powers, historic rivals, formed an alliance of convenience. Their goal was simple: to march on Beijing and extract a final, total submission from the Dragon Throne. And so began the Second Opium War. It was, in many ways, a replay of the first, but on a grander, more brutal scale. An Anglo-French force seized Canton, ruling the city through a puppet governor for nearly 4 years. They pushed north, their steam-powered gunboats and rifled muskets brushing aside the Qing's valiant but antiquated banner armies. The Chinese fought with desperate courage. At the Taku forts, which guarded the river approach to Tianjin and Beijing, they mounted a ferocious defence, repelling an initial British assault and sinking several gunboats. It was a brief, shocking victory for the Qing, a moment of pride that only served to harden the resolve of the invaders. A year later, in the summer of 1860, the Allies returned with a much larger force, overwhelming the forts and marching inland. The road to Beijing was now open. The Xianfeng Emperor and his court were paralysed by indecision, vacillating between fighting and negotiating. They captured a British diplomatic party that included Harry Parkes, the man who started it all, subjecting them to torture. Several died. For the British commander, Lord Elgin, the son of the very same Lord Elgin who had famously removed the marbles from the Parthenon in Athens, this was the final straw. It was a violation of all European codes of conduct, an act of barbarism that required a unique and terrible punishment. When his forces reached the outskirts of Beijing, they found their prize. Just a few miles northwest of the city walls lay the Yuanmingyuan, the Gardens of Perfect Brightness. We call it the Old Summer Palace. It was not a single building, but a vast sprawling complex of 3 hectares. It was a wonderland of man-made hills, lakes and streams dotted with more than 200 pavilions, palaces, temples and libraries. It was the Qing dynasty's private retreat, its heart, where the emperors had governed and lived for 150 years. Within its walls was the most magnificent collection of art and treasures ever assembled in China. Silks, priceless porcelain, ancient jade carvings, gold and silver artifacts, and an immense library containing unique books and manuscripts, the collected wisdom and history of a civilization. It was also a place of surprising cultural fusion, featuring a series of European-style palaces designed for the Qianlong Emperor by Jesuit missionaries, complete with grand Baroque fountains. It was, in short, a microcosm of the empire's wealth, sophistication and power. What happened next was not an act of war. It was an act of organised industrial-scale plunder. For 2 days, British and French soldiers ran riot through the palace grounds. They used their rifle butts to smash open cabinets, pried gems from thrones, and stuffed their pockets with whatever they could carry. Officers methodically selected the finest pieces to be crated up and sent back to Europe as spoils of war. A captain described the scene as a kind of delirious madness. Soldiers dressing up in the Empress's silk robes, adorning themselves with pearls and drinking the Emperor's rice wine. It was a frenzied desecration. But the looting was only the prelude. Lord Elgin needed to leave a scar that would be seen from the Forbidden City itself. He needed to punish the Emperor personally, to break the dynasty's prestige in a way that no treaty could. He gave the order. On October 18, 1860, a force of 300 British troops marched into the Yuanmingyuan with torches. They set it alight. For 3 straight days, the magnificent wooden palaces burned. The smoke, thick and black, blotted out the sun, creating a terrifying midday twilight over Beijing. The intense heat cracked the marble structures, and the sky rained ash and embers down upon the capital. The ashes of 1,000 years of artistry, of irreplaceable books and paintings, were carried on the wind. It was a profound act of cultural destruction, an attempt to erase a memory. When the fires finally died down, all that remained were charred timbers and the broken, blackened stones of the European palaces, standing like skeletal ruins in a landscape of ash. The emperor, who had already fled his capital, was broken. The Qing court had no choice but to accept the humiliating convention of Peking. The terms were crushing. The opium trade was now fully and officially legalized. More ports were opened, including ports far up the Yangtze, giving foreigners access to the very heart of the country. Christianity could be preached freely. Massive new indemnities were levied, and for the first time foreign ambassadors were to be permitted to reside in Beijing. The war was over. The British and French had gotten everything they wanted. But in the process of prying China open, they had set fire to its soul. The embers of the Summer Palace would glow for a century in the Chinese consciousness, a symbol of a profound and violent humiliation, a fire that would one day be rekindled as the spirit of revolution. While the cannons of the Royal Navy were blasting open the gates of China, and French soldiers were pocketing imperial treasures, another flag was becoming a familiar sight in the waters of the Pearl River Delta. It was the Stars and Stripes. The Americans were there too. They have been largely written out of the popular story of the Opium Wars, casting themselves as neutral observers, as reluctant latecomers, or even as a moderating influence on the more aggressive British. History, however, keeps meticulous receipts. The American role in the opium trade was not one of innocence, but of quiet, shrewd, and fantastically profitable participation. They were not empire builders in the British mould, not yet. They were something simpler, and perhaps more modern. They were master traders, and opium was just another commodity in a global portfolio, no different from ginseng or furs or cotton. Morality was a concern for the preachers back home. In Canton, the only thing that mattered was the bottom line. The American presence in China was not new. The first American trading ship, the Empress of China, had arrived in Canton in 1784, just a year after the Treaty of Paris formally ended the American Revolution. The young republic was hungry for commerce, and the old China trade was a golden opportunity. But the Americans faced a problem, the same problem the British had faced. China wanted very little from the West except its silver. To balance the trade, the Americans needed a product the Chinese would actually buy, and they found it. Not in Bengal, like the British, but much farther west, in the poppy fields of the Ottoman Empire. The Americans became the primary smugglers of high-quality Turkish opium. This trade was not conducted by shadowy pirates or rogue sea captains. It was the domain of the most respectable and powerful merchant families of New England. These were the Boston Brahmins, the new nation's aristocracy, men whose names would later adorn universities, hospitals, and cultural institutions. Their stories are woven into the very fabric of American industry and philanthropy. But the initial thread was spun from the opium poppy. Take, for instance, the Delano family of Massachusetts. Warren Delano Jr., the maternal grandfather of a future American president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, made his first fortune in China. He arrived in Canton in 1833 and soon became a senior partner in the largest American firm there, Russell and Company. Their business was diverse, but its most lucrative branch was the illegal importation of opium. Warren Delano was not some back-alley drug pusher. He was a pillar of the American expatriate community, a man of letters and impeccable social standing. He saw no moral conflict in his work. He wrote home that he considered the trade to be fair, honourable and legitimate, and even argued, with a straight face, that it was no more harmful than the trade in wine and spirits back in America. He simply viewed the Chinese prohibition as an irrational barrier to free trade, an obstacle to be cleverly circumvented for the sake of profit. His profits were immense. He returned to America a wealthy man, his fortune providing the foundation for generations of Delano family influence. And then there were the Forbeses, another storied Boston clan. John Murray Forbes, a giant of 19th century American business, also began his career with Russell and Company, managing the firm's opium-laden clipper ships as they raced across the seas from Turkey to China. The speed of the American-built clippers, like the famous Sea Witch, gave them a competitive edge, allowing them to deliver their valuable, illicit cargo faster than anyone else. Forbes, like Delano, parlayed his China trade profits into a vast American empire of railroads and finance. The money, laundered by time and respectable investments, became the bedrock of Bostonian society. The Perkins family, the Cabot family, the Lowe family, the list reads like a who's who of the New England elite, all of them deeply entangled in a trade that was creating addiction and social decay half a world away. The American operation was a masterclass in logistics. They would purchase raw opium in the port of Smyrna, modern-day Izmir in Turkey. The sticky, dark bricks were packed into chests and loaded onto the sleek, fast clipper ships for the long, arduous voyage around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, and through the Straits of Malacca into the South China Sea. They didn't unload in Canton itself. Instead, they used floating warehouses, old ships permanently anchored offshore at places like Linton Island. Here, in international waters, the opium was sold to Chinese smugglers in their fast crabs or scrambling dragons, small, heavily armed boats that could outrun the Qing patrols. The Americans would receive payment in silver, which they would then use to buy the tea, silk and porcelain that American markets craved. It was a perfect self-sustaining triangle of trade with opium as its indispensable lubricant. During the First Opium War, the United States remained officially neutral, a position that proved extraordinarily convenient. While the Royal Navy was busy fighting, American merchants from Russell and Company happily took over the British share of the market, selling their Turkish product to eager buyers while their main competitors were otherwise occupied. They profited from the war without firing a shot. But history has a way of coming full circle. The trade that these Yankee merchants had so skillfully exploited abroad would eventually come home. After the Opium Wars and the concurrent gold rush in California, a wave of Chinese immigrants crossed the Pacific seeking work building the great transcontinental railroads that men like John Murray Forbes were financing. They brought with them many things: their culture, their food, their labour, and the solace of the opium pipe. The vice that had been so profitably exported to China now established a beachhead in America. In the sprawling labyrinthine Chinatowns of San Francisco and other western cities, opium dens began to appear. They were quiet, shadowy places, filled with the sweet, cloying smell of burning opium. Here, weary labourers could, for a few cents, lie down on a wooden bunk, take up the pipe and briefly escape the hardship of their lives. For decades it was seen by white Americans as an exotic contained Chinese problem, but inevitably the practice began to seep out into the broader culture, creating fear, moral panic, and eventually America's own first wave of anti-drug legislation. The Yankee traders had, in their relentless pursuit of profit, unknowingly brought the seeds of the drug plague back to their own shores. The dragon's breath had crossed the ocean. While the poppy bled for the coffers of empire in the east, its ghost had long haunted the west, not in a smoky den, but in a small, respectable glass bottle. It sat on the mantelpiece in the Victorian home, nestled between the family Bible and a daguerreotype of a stern-faced ancestor. It was kept in the mother's purse, tucked in the waistcoat of the parliamentarian, and stored in the medicine chests of the most esteemed physicians in London, Paris and Boston. This ghost was called laudanum, and for a century it was the angel in the bottle. The recipe, refined by the English physician Thomas Sydenham back in the 17th century, was deceptively simple. Opium, dissolved in alcohol, often with a hint of cinnamon or saffron for flavour. It was a tincture, a liquid delivery system for the poppy's power, and its availability was staggering. It required no prescription. It was sold by the penny's worth at the corner chemist, the local grocer, the travelling peddler. It was cheaper than gin, more reliable than prayer. It was the great panacea of the industrial age, a sovereign remedy for the aches and anxieties of a world churning with steam and steel. For the working-class mother in a Manchester slum, it was a godsend. A few drops on a sugar lump would quiet a teething, screaming infant, allowing her a few precious hours of sleep before her shift at the textile mill began. Products like Godfrey's Cordial or Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup were household names, their advertisements promising blissful peace for both mother and child. They were, of course, mostly laudanum. A quiet, compliant generation was being raised on opium, their first taste of tranquility delivered not from a loving cradle, but from a dark, syrupy liquid. The infant mortality rate from opiate overdose, often recorded as maternal overlay, or debility from birth, was a silent, unacknowledged catastrophe. But this was not merely a problem of the poor, it was an epidemic of the respectable. In the drawing rooms of Bloomsbury and the salons of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, laudanum was the crutch for the sensitive soul. The weaker sex, as women were so clinically described, were particularly susceptible. Diagnosed with the catch-all ailment of hysteria or neurasthenia, a condition encompassing everything from anxiety and depression to simple boredom, middle and upper class women were prescribed laudanum as a calming tonic. It smoothed the frayed nerves, dulled the pain of a constrained existence, and cast a warm, hazy glow over the rigid expectations of society. The perfect Victorian wife, placid, serene, untroubled, was often a woman maintained in a state of perpetual low-grade opiate intoxication. It was the chemical corset for the female mind. The literary and artistic world was saturated with it. The poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, prescribed opium for toothache and rheumatism, became a lifelong addict. His fantastical poem, Kubla Khan, famously composed in a laudanum-induced reverie. Thomas de Quincey's sensational 1821 memoir, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, turned the experience of laudanum addiction into a Gothic romanticised journey into the sublime and the terrifying. His vivid descriptions of celestial dreams and hellish nightmares created a cultural fascination with the drug, stripping away some of the medicinal pretense and revealing the psychological depths it could plumb. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the Bronte siblings, Edgar Allan Poe, the list of creative minds who relied on the divine potion is a veritable canon of 19th century literature. They used it to manage chronic illness, to fuel their imaginations, to escape the suffocating pressures of their own genius. The angel in the bottle was also the artist's muse. The scale of this quiet dependency was immense. In the 1860s, it was estimated that the Fens region of England, a marshy, damp land where aches and ague were common, consumed more than half of all the opium imported into the country. The average consumption per capita in Britain was staggering, far exceeding that of even China at the height of its crisis. The United States was no different. Patent medicines with heroic names like Black Drop and McMunn's Elixir were staples in every American home. Their opiate contents are closely guarded, or rather completely unregulated secret. During the American Civil War, morphine, opium's primary alkaloid isolated in 1804, was distributed so liberally to wounded soldiers that opiate addiction became known as the soldier's disease. The invention of the hypodermic syringe in the 1850s only refined the problem. Now, morphine could be injected directly into the bloodstream, bypassing the digestive system for a faster, more potent effect. It was seen as a miracle of modern medicine, a scientific application far removed from the murky world of laudanum tinctures. Yet it simply created a more efficient addict. By the late 19th century, the medical community was finally beginning to awaken to the crisis it had helped create. The placid laudanum user had become the agitated morphinist. The angel in the bottle was now recognised as a demon, and the doctors who had prescribed it so freely now desperately sought a cure for the very addiction that they had fostered. The stage was set for a new miracle, a scientific solution to a scientific problem. The world needed a hero, and in a pristine German laboratory, one was about to be synthesized. The place was Elberfeld, Germany, the year 18 The world was thrumming with scientific optimism, a belief that chemistry and industry could solve any human problem. In the humming laboratories of Friedrich Bayer and Company, a burgeoning chemical and pharmaceutical giant, a young chemist named Felix Hoffmann was hard at work. He was a diligent, methodical man, not a flamboyant visionary. His task was straightforward, to find new marketable compounds. He had been assigned to a project to create a less irritating form of salicylic acid to treat his father's painful rheumatism. In this, he was brilliantly successful, creating acetyl salicylic acid, a stable compound that the world would soon come to know as aspirin. It was a monumental achievement, a drug that would ease the minor pains of billions. But on his workbench, another experiment was underway, one with far darker potential. The target was morphine. For decades, morphine had been the undisputed king of painkillers, but its addictive properties were now a source of immense medical concern and social stigma. Bayer, like every other pharmaceutical firm, was chasing a holy grail, a painkiller as powerful as morphine, but without its devastating side effects and addictive grip. The company was particularly interested in creating a more effective cough suppressant. In an age rife with tuberculosis, pneumonia and bronchitis, a potent medicine to control violent, racking coughs was a guaranteed commercial blockbuster. The prevailing theory was that by modifying the morphine molecule, its negative effects could be engineered away, leaving only the therapeutic benefits. Working under the direction of Heinrich Draeser, the head of Bayer's pharmacology lab, Hoffmann turned his attention to an old formula. 23 years earlier, in 1874, an English chemist named C.R. Alder Wright had first synthesized the same compound at St. Mary's Hospital in London by boiling morphine with acetic anhydride, a chemical cousin of vinegar. But Wright's discovery had gone nowhere. It was a laboratory curiosity. Hoffmann, with Bayer's industrial might behind him, replicated the process. He acetylated morphine, creating a new substance, diacetylmorphine. The initial tests, conducted by Dresser on rabbits, frogs, and eventually on the factory workers at Bayer, were astonishing. The compound was a phenomenally effective respiratory suppressant. It calmed coughs with an efficacy that left codeine, the current standard, in the dust. More than that, it seemed to produce a sense of well-being, a warm, untroubled euphoria in the human test subjects. Dresser was ecstatic. He believed he had found the miracle drug. He claimed, based on these limited and deeply flawed initial studies, that diacetylmorphine was not only more effective than morphine, but crucially that it was not addictive. In fact, he promoted it as a cure for morphine addiction itself. The logic was as simple as it was catastrophic. A patient struggling with morphine dependency could be switched to this new compound, and then, because it was supposedly non-addictive, they could be gently weaned off it with ease. All that was needed was a name. The drug made its users feel powerful, uplifted, even heroic. And so Bayer's marketing department christened it heroin. It was a trademark, a brand name meant to evoke strength and triumph. In 1898, the Bayer company launched one of the most ambitious and, in hindsight, most destructive global marketing campaigns in history. Heroin was sold as a liquid syrup and in pill form, packaged in neat little bottles bearing the now famous Bayer cross logo. Advertisements were placed in medical journals around the world. Free samples were mailed to thousands of physicians across Europe and America, accompanied by literature extolling its virtues. It was the sedative for coughs, a treatment for asthma, bronchitis, and the dreaded tuberculosis. It was promoted for everything from stomach cancer to schizophrenia. And above all, it was the safe, non-habit-forming substitute for morphine. For a few years, the world believed it. Doctors, desperate for a solution to the iatrogenic morphine crisis they had created, embraced heroin with open arms. They prescribed it enthusiastically, confident in the scientific pronouncements of the prestigious German company. Patients loved it, it worked, and it made them feel wonderful. But soon disturbing reports began to trickle in. Doctors noticed that their patients, prescribed heroin to cure their morphine addiction, were developing a new, far more ravenous dependency. They needed more of the drug, more often. When they tried to stop, the withdrawal symptoms were exponentially worse than those of morphine, a hell of sheer physical and psychological agony. The awful truth of the chemistry finally dawned. The two acetyl groups attached to the morphine molecule did not weaken its effects, they supercharged them. Diacetylmorphine was more fat-soluble than morphine, which allowed it to cross the blood-brain barrier with incredible speed and efficiency. Once in the brain, the body's enzymes stripped away the acetyl groups, converting it back into morphine, but now delivered in a massive, instantaneous flood right to the brain's opioid receptors. It was, in essence, a high-speed delivery system for morphine. Bayer had not created a cure, it had created a chemical Trojan horse. The heroic drug was simply a far more efficient, far more addictive version of the very substance it was meant to replace. By the early 1900s, the dream was over. Hospitals in the United States began reporting cases of heroinism. Addicts, finding their prescriptions cut off, turned to the black market. The angel in the bottle had been replaced by a hero in a syringe, and the cure had become a curse of unprecedented virulence. Bayer, facing a storm of criticism, quietly ceased production in 1913, but the damage was done. The genie was not just out of the bottle, it had been weaponized, commercialized, and distributed to every corner of the globe. The poppy's chemical children laudanum, morphine, and now heroin were running rampant. The problem was no longer confined to the back alleys of Shanghai or the parlours of London. It was a global plague, and it had become painfully clear that no single nation could contain it. The world, slowly and reluctantly, was beginning to awaken. The catalyst for this awakening came from an unlikely quarter: the United States, a nation that had only recently stepped onto the world stage as a colonial power. In 1898, following the Spanish-American War, the US acquired the Philippines, and with it, a messy inherited problem. The Spanish colonial administration had operated a licensed opium monopoly, selling the drug to the Chinese population in the islands. For the American government, steeped in a Protestant moralistic fervour, this was an intolerable situation. State-sanctioned vice was not the American way. A key figure in this drama was an Episcopal missionary named Bishop Charles Henry Brent. A man of immense moral conviction and diplomatic skill, Brent was assigned to the Philippines in Taiwan. There, he witnessed firsthand the debilitating effects of opium addiction on the local population. He saw it not as a mere vice, but as a profound moral and social evil that sapped the strength of individuals and communities. He became a tireless crusader, arguing that the United States had a moral obligation not only to ban opium in the Philippines, but to lead an international movement against the entire narcotics trade. His impassioned pleas found a receptive ear in President Theodore Roosevelt, a man who understood the power of a moral crusade to project American influence on the global stage. Roosevelt and his State Department, particularly the energetic Dr. Hamilton Wright, saw an opportunity. By taking the lead on opium control, the United States could assert its newfound international standing, curry favour with China, a vast and coveted market, and put moral pressure on the old European colonial powers, especially Great Britain, whose Indian opium trade was still the linchpin of the entire global system. It was a perfect marriage of high-minded idealism and shrewd geopolitics. The first step was to gather the facts. In 1908, President Roosevelt called for an international meeting. The following year, in the cold February of 1909, delegates from 13 nations with interests in the Far East converged on Shanghai. This was the Shanghai Opium Commission. It was not a conference to write treaties or make binding laws. It was, in essence, a grand international study group. Its purpose was to share information, to assess the scale of the problem, and to establish a common ground of understanding. The atmosphere in Shanghai was thick with diplomatic tension. The American delegation, led by Bishop Brent, arrived with the zeal of missionaries, pushing for a strong condemnation of the opium trade in all its forms. The Chinese representatives, led by the venerable official Tang Guo'an, made a desperate and moving appeal for help, detailing their nation's long and painful struggle against the drug and their commitment to a 10-year plan to eradicate poppy cultivation. But the British delegation, representing the world's largest producer and trafficker of opium, was in a defensive crouch. They were willing to make concessions on smoking opium, which was seen as a uniquely oriental vice, but they fiercely defended their right to produce and export opium from India for medicinal purposes, a category that was conveniently broad and enormously profitable. For 3 weeks the delegates debated. They presented statistics on production, consumption, and addiction. They argued over the distinction between medicinal use and recreational use, between opium eating and opium smoking. Despite the deep divisions, the Commission was a landmark moment. For the first time, the major powers of the world sat together in one room to discuss narcotics as a shared international problem. The Commission concluded by passing 9 resolutions. They were non-binding, little more than strong suggestions. They condemned the practice of opium smoking and recommended that governments take steps to gradually suppress it. They urged strict control over the manufacture and sale of morphine and other derivatives. Most importantly, they called for a future conference with full diplomatic powers to codify these principles into international law. Shanghai had not solved the problem, but it had officially put it on the global agenda. The world had acknowledged the existence of the plague. The momentum from Shanghai carried forward. After years of diplomatic manoeuvring, the next great meeting was convened in The Hague in the Netherlands. The Hague International Opium Convention of 1912 was a far more ambitious affair. 46 nations were invited. The goal this time was not just to talk, but to create the world's first international drug control treaty. The negotiations were complex and arduous, stretching over weeks. Again, the primary fault line lay between the moralistic prohibitionism of the Americans and Chinese and the commercial pragmatism of the British, Dutch, Portuguese and Germans, all of whom had colonial or industrial interests in the drug trade. The final document, signed on January 23rd, 1912, was a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise. It was a framework, not a hammer. Chapter 1 obligated signatory nations to control the production and distribution of raw opium. Chapter 2 dealt with prepared opium, the kind used for smoking, committing nations to its gradual and effective suppression. And in a crucial expansion of the agenda, Chapter 3 addressed the new chemical demons that had emerged from Western laboratories. It called for the nations to enact laws to control the sale and use of medicinal opium, morphine, cocaine, and, by name, heroin. Signatory powers were required to limit the manufacture and trade of these substances exclusively to medical and legitimate purposes. It was a monumental step. The convention established the fundamental principle that would govern drug policy for the next century, that the production and supply of narcotic drugs was a shared international responsibility. It moved the problem out of the realm of private commerce and into the domain of public law and international treaty. Yet its immediate impact was limited. The treaty had significant weaknesses. It did not mandate specific penalties or create a powerful international body to enforce its provisions. Ratification was a slow, painful process. Germany, for example, refused to ratify until all other powers had done so. A classic diplomatic delaying tactic to protect its powerful pharmaceutical industry, which was a major producer of morphine and cocaine. And then, just as the fragile gears of this new international machine were beginning to turn, the world plunged into darkness. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in 1914 set off the cataclysm of the First World War. The spirit of international cooperation evaporated, replaced by the brutal logic of total war. The nations that had sat together at The Hague were now trying to annihilate one another. The opium poppy, ever the opportunist, thrived in the chaos. Morphine was needed on an industrial scale to treat the millions of wounded soldiers on the battlefields of Europe, creating a new generation of addicts. The world's first attempt to awaken and control the empire of the poppy had been deferred, drowned out by the sound of artillery. The laws had been written, the principles established, but the long global war on drugs had barely even begun. The great colonial empires, which had once so diligently managed the poppy's flow, were now little more than ghosts haunting their former territories. They left behind them a world of new lines drawn on old maps, and in the spaces between those lines, in the vacuums of power they created, something new and wild began to grow. As the tricolour of France and the Union Jack of Britain were lowered for the final time across Indochina and Burma, the intricate systems of control they had established, the state monopolies, the licensed dens, the colonial police, all withered away. Nature and human nature abhors a vacuum. And into this one stepped men with guns, men with ambition, and men who understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of the poppy. The stage for this new act in our long drama was a place that wasn't really a place at all, but a convergence of mountains and borders, a rugged, mist-shrouded territory where Burma, Thailand and Laos bleed into one another. It was a cartographer's nightmare and a smuggler's dream. They would come to call it the Golden Triangle. Before the Second World War, this region was a modest, almost artisanal producer of opium, mostly for local consumption and some light smuggling into China. But history was about to deliver a catalyst. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists triumphed in the Chinese Civil War, and the nationalist army of the Kuomintang, the KMT, shattered. A portion of this defeated army, thousands of soldiers from the 93rd Division, refused to surrender. They were a lost legion, an army without a country, and so they fled. marching south over the border and into the remote, ungoverned highlands of Burma's Shan state. They were a problem for the fledgling Burmese government, which couldn't possibly control them. But for another, more distant power, they were an opportunity. In Washington, D.C., the Cold War was entering its chilling prime. The fall of China was seen as a catastrophic loss, and the domino theory, the idea that nations would fall to communism one by one, was taking root. The CIA in its infancy was tasked with stopping the dominoes from falling by any means necessary. They looked at this stranded KMT army in the Shan Hills and saw a perfect proxy force, a dagger to be pointed at the soft underbelly of Red China. So, a quiet partnership was formed. Under a program codenamed Operation Paper, the CIA began to secretly supply the KMT remnants. Weapons, ammunition, and advisors arrived via clandestine night flights from Thailand. The plan was simple: build up this ghost army, harass the Chinese communists, and maybe, just maybe, one day help them retake the mainland. But armies, even ghost armies, are expensive. They need food, they need medicine, they need to pay their soldiers. The CIA's funding was a trickle, not a flood. The KMT needed a more sustainable business model. And all around them, in the hills of the Shan state, the poppy bloomed in crimson and white. The local hill tribes, the Wa, the Shan, the Lahu, had been growing it for generations. The KMT commanders, hardened realists, saw the obvious solution. They weren't merchants of vice, they were pragmatists. They organised the scattered, small-scale cultivation into a vertically integrated industry. They levied a tax on the peasant farmers, a poppy tax payable in raw opium. They established their own laboratories to refine the sticky brown gum into morphine base, and then into high-grade No. 4 heroin, a fine white powder perfect for the international market. And most importantly, they controlled the logistics. They organised vast mule caravans, hundreds of animals strong, guarded by heavily armed soldiers, to transport the product out of the mountains. The opium trails, once faint footpaths, became highways of contraband leading south to the porous border with Thailand. There, corrupt officials in the Thai military and police, also staunch anti-communists and therefore allies of convenience for the Americans, were happy to look the other way for a price. The Golden Triangle was born not of ancient tradition, but of modern geopolitics. It was a narco-state forged in the crucible of the Cold War, a secret little enterprise underwritten by the war on communism. The irony was exquisite. While America was beginning to fret about a nascent drug problem at home, its own intelligence agency was midwifing the birth of the world's largest heroin-producing syndicate. The operation was a geopolitical failure. The KMT's pinprick raids into China were easily repulsed, but it was a spectacular business success. By the late 50s, the Golden Triangle had supplanted China as the primary source of illicit opium in Asia. Then the conflict next door in Vietnam poured gasoline on the fire. The CIA's secret war in Laos, supporting the Royal Lao government and Hmong tribesmen against the communist Pathet Lao, created an even greater demand for unconventional logistics. To service this secret war, the agency created its own private airline, a legendary outfit called Air America. Its pilots, daring and discreet, flew C-47s and Pilatus Porters into dirt strips carved out of the jungle, delivering rice and rifles to anti-communist allies. On the return flights, the planes were often empty, but cargo space, like a power vacuum, rarely stays empty for long. The planes that brought in the tools of war often flew out with the raw materials of the drug trade. Opium from among poppy fields in the mountains of Laos found its way onto Air America planes, which flew it to collection points, including the CIA's own headquarters in northern Laos. From there, it fed into the same networks run by KMT remnants and corrupt high official. The logic was inescapable. The Hmong needed money to buy food, to survive, to fight. The poppy was their only cash crop. To keep them as allies, you had to accept their business. The war on communism took precedence over any other consideration. This fertile chaos allowed powerful new players to emerge from the local population. None was more formidable than a man named Chang Chi-fu, who had become known to the world as Kun Sa. Of mixed Chinese and Shan heritage, he was a master of his environment. He raised his own private army, the Shan United Army, ostensibly to fight for the independence of the Shan people. In reality, he was building a drug empire. He fought the KMT for control of the opium routes. He fought the Burmese army. He sometimes even allied with them. He was a warlord, nationalist and a CEO, all rolled into one. At the height of his power in the 1970s and 80s, Khun Sa controlled an estimated 70% of the heroin flowing out of the Golden Triangle. He built a massive headquarters at Ho Mong in the Thai-Burma borderlands, a town complete with schools, a hospital, and surface-to-air missiles to protect his refineries. He gave interviews to journalists portraying himself as a freedom fighter, claiming he was only in the drug business to fund his people's revolution. He even once made a public offer to sell the entire US government his yearly opium harvest, arguing it was the most efficient way to keep it off American streets. Washington declined the offer. By the time American soldiers were fighting in the jungles of Vietnam, the Golden Triangle's heroin had begun to follow them there. Potent No. 4 heroin, 95% pure, was so cheap and plentiful in Saigon that GIs could buy it for a few dollars a vial. Addiction rates skyrocketed among the troops. The war had come full circle. The secret operations designed to contain communism in Southeast Asia had cultivated a product that was now incapacitating the very soldiers sent to fight for that cause. The dragon had begun to eat its own tail. The Golden Triangle was the poppy's new kingdom, a shadowy, mountainous realm built on the Cold War paranoia, fueled by covert operations, and destined to poison the world for decades to come. But kingdoms rise and fall. As the 80s wore on, the Golden Triangle began to lose its luster. A concerted crackdown by the Thai government, under pressure from the United States, began to close the crucial smuggling routes. The Burmese military launched new offensives against Khun Sa and the other warlords. Production didn't stop, but the logistics became more difficult, the business riskier. And just as one door began to close for the poppy, another one, halfway across the world, was about to be kicked wide open. The flower is patient. It knows how to migrate. It simply waits for the right soil, the right climate, and the right kind of human chaos. It found all three in the high, desolate plains and jagged mountains of Afghanistan. For centuries, Afghanistan had been a minor character in our story, a small-time cultivator of opium for regional markets in Persia and India. It was a rugged, fiercely independent land, a crossroads of empires that had rarely been successfully conquered or governed. This very ungovernability made it perfect. The story of its ascent begins, as it so often does, with an invasion. On Christmas Eve 1979, the Soviet Union rolled its tanks across the Amudarya River to prop up a failing communist government in Kabul. They thought it would be a short, sharp affair. Instead, they walked into a decade-long nightmare. The Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, rose up. It was a holy war, a jihad, against the godless Soviet invaders, and once again, Washington saw an opportunity to bleed its Cold War rival. Through Operation Cyclone, the CIA began one of the largest and most expensive covert operations in its history. It funneled billions of dollars in weapons, not directly, but through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI. The ISI, in turn, chose which Mujahideen commanders would receive the Stinger missiles and the AK-47s. To fight a war, these commanders needed more than just guns. They needed cash. They needed to feed their fighters, buy intelligence, and purchase non-military supplies. The CIA provided weapons, but not a payroll. The poppy provided the payroll. The conditions were perfect. Decades of low-level development under the Afghan monarchy had created a basic network of roads and irrigation systems, particularly in the fertile Helmand River Valley. The war destroyed the country's legitimate economy, but left this infrastructure largely intact. Farmers who once grew wheat or pomegranates could no longer get their crops to market. But opium was different. It didn't need refrigeration. It wasn't bulky. A local trader, often connected to a Mujahideen commander, would come directly to the farm, pay in cash, and take the raw opium gum away. It was the ultimate wartime cash crop. The commanders encouraged its cultivation, taxed it, and protected the smuggling routes. The labs that cooked the opium into heroin sprang up in the lawless tribal areas of Pakistan just across the border, often under the protection of the same ISI agents who were distributing the CIA's weapons. The heroin flowed out along the same routes the weapons flowed in. The Khyber Pass became a two-way street. The scale of the transformation was breathtaking. In Sindanai, Afghanistan produced perhaps 100 tons of opium a year. By the end of the Soviet occupation a decade later, it was producing thousands of tons. It had become the undisputed global leader, the Saudi Arabia of opium, leaving the Golden Triangle far behind. The war against the Soviets was won, but the price of that victory was the creation of a narco-state. The infrastructure of jihad had merged perfectly with the infrastructure of drug trafficking. When the Soviets withdrew in 1989, the chaos did not end. The victorious Mujahideen factions turned on one another in a vicious civil war that tore the country, and especially the capital Kabul, to pieces. Warlords carved out fiefdoms, and their primary source of income was, invariably, the poppy. Amid this anarchy, a new force emerged from the religious schools, the madrasas, of southern Afghanistan and Pakistan. They called themselves the Taliban, the students. They were austere, pious, and utterly ruthless. They promised to replace the chaos of the warlords with the purity of Islamic law, and they swept across the country with shocking speed. The Taliban's relationship with the poppy was a masterpiece of cynical pragmatism. They declared it haram, forbidden by Islam, but they did not eradicate it. Instead, they perfected the system of taxation. They introduced a 10% Islamic tax, or usha, on the opium harvest. It was efficient, it was lucrative, and it funded their war machine, allowing them to conquer nearly 90% of the country. They became the world's first and only drug cartel to also run a government. Then, in July of 2000, in a bid for international legitimacy and aid, their leader, Mullah Omar, did something extraordinary. He issued an edict from on high, a decree backed by the full brutal force of his regime, banning all poppy cultivation. And because the Taliban's control was absolute, it worked. In a single season, they wiped out the world's largest opium crop. Production in Afghanistan fell by over 90%. The United Nations Drug Control Office verified it from satellite photos. It was the most successful counter-narcotics effort in human history. It also caused a global heroin drought and panic among the world's addicts. This strange, quiet period lasted just over a year. On September 11, 2001, 2 planes struck the World Trade Center in New York. The Taliban's guests, Al-Qaeda, had declared war on the United States. Weeks later, American bombs began to fall on Afghanistan. The Taliban regime crumbled. In the power vacuum that followed, the warlords America allied with to overthrow them, the very same Mujahideen commanders from the 1980s, promptly went back into the only business they knew. The poppy fields bloomed again with a vengeance. Under the watch of the US and NATO forces, poppy cultivation in Afghanistan exploded to levels never before seen. The reasons were complex and tragic. The coalition's primary mission was fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, not eradicating poppies. To destroy a farmer's only source of income was to create a new enemy, to push him directly into the arms of the resurgent Taliban. The Taliban, now the insurgents, also returned to the opium trade. It was the perfect way to fund their war against the new foreign invaders. The poppy paid for the IEDs that killed American and British soldiers. It paid for the rifles, the rockets, and the suicide vests. The hundreds of billions of dollars spent on the war on terror were pitted against an insurgency funded by the very drug that was creating a public health crisis back in the West. It was a perfect self-sustaining circle of violence and addiction, a war feeding a drug trade that in turn fed the war. The poppy was no longer just a cash crop, it was a strategic weapon, the lifeblood of the longest war in American history. The fields of Helmand and Kandahar were not just agricultural land, they were battlefields, watered with blood and blooming with a terrible perpetual harvest. This vast, unstoppable river of opium flowing from the mountains of Central Asia had to go somewhere. It snaked its way along ancient smuggling corridors, the Balkan route through Iran and Turkey into Europe, the northern route through the former Soviet republics to Russia, the old Silk Road, now paved with heroin, into China. It fed the habits of millions, a global enterprise of breathtaking hail and efficiency. But as the 21st century dawned, this ancient plant-based trade was about to collide with a new and strangely parallel crisis, one born not in a dusty field but in a sterile laboratory. The poppy's oldest promise, the relief of pain, was about to be reborn in a modern, deceptively safe-looking form, and it would create a new geography of despair far from the battlefields of Afghanistan. The story begins in the United States, in the corporate offices of a pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family. For decades, strong opioids like morphine and oxycodone had been used in medicine, but their use was heavily restricted, reserved mostly for acute post-surgical pain and end-of-life cancer care. The medical establishment understood from over a century of bitter experience that they were powerfully addictive. The Sacklers, however, saw not a danger, but a vast, untapped market. The immense population of people suffering from chronic non-cancer pain, from bad backs to arthritis. The challenge was to convince doctors that a powerful opioid could be prescribed safely for long periods, for everyday ailments. In 1996, they launched their weapon. It was a pill called OxyContin, a formulation of pure oxycodone in a clever time-release mechanism. The company's marketing campaign for this new drug was one of the most aggressive and tragically successful in history. They funded thousands of pain management seminars for doctors. They produced slick promotional videos and literature, and they pushed a single, revolutionary and deeply misleading claim that because of its time-release formula, the risk of addiction from OxyContin was less than 1%. They took the terrifying, unpredictable power of the poppy and packaged it in a clean, clinical, doctor-approved pill. They even helped promote a new, compassionate-sounding idea throughout the medical community that pain is the fifth vital sign, something that should be treated as aggressively as blood pressure or heart rate. It worked beyond their wildest dreams. Doctors, assured the risk was negligible, began prescribing OxyContin for an ever-expanding list of conditions. Prescriptions soared. Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family made billions upon billions of dollars. A generation of patients trusting their doctors were put on a steady daily diet of a narcotic more powerful than street heroin. They weren't back-alley junkies. They were factory workers, farmers, housewives, high school athletes. They were simply treating their pain. But the less than 1% claim was a catastrophic falsehood. The time-release mechanism could be easily defeated by crushing or chewing the pill, delivering the full, potent dose at once. And even when taken as prescribed, many more than 1% found themselves inexorably dependent. They developed a tolerance, needing more and more of the drug to achieve the same effect, to simply feel normal, to stave off the horrors of withdrawal. An entire nation was being systematically addicted, not by street dealers, but by its own healthcare system. Then came the inevitable crackdown. As overdose deaths mounted into the tens of thousands, and the truth about OxyContin's addictive potential became undeniable, authorities began to tighten the rules. States created prescription monitoring programs. Doctors became terrified of being prosecuted and began cutting their patients off. The supply of pills, which had once seemed endless, suddenly dried up. And here our two stories, the ancient and the modern, converge in a final terrible synthesis. What happens to a person whose body and brain have been rewired by years of high-dose prescription opioids when the prescription runs out? They get sick, desperately sick, and they seek relief. On the streets, another product was waiting for them. A product that was suddenly cheaper and far more available than a bottle of illicit OxyContin pills. It was heroin. And thanks to the poppy's perpetual harvest in far-off Afghanistan, the American market was flooded with it. The very people who would never have dreamed of trying street drugs, who started their journey with a legitimate prescription from a trusted doctor, now found themselves meeting a dealer in a parking lot. They learned to cook the brown powder in a spoon and find a vein. The demographics of heroin addiction in America changed overnight. It was no longer confined to the inner cities. It moved into the suburbs, into the small towns of the Rust Belt and Appalachia, the very heartland of the country. The Afghan farmer tending his poppies in Helmand and the laid-off factory worker in Ohio were now connected, two distant, unwitting nodes in the same global network of pain. And the poppy had one last cruel trick up its sleeve. As authorities cracked down on heroin, traffickers began to mix it with, or replace it entirely, with something even more potent and dangerous. Synthetic opioids like fentanyl, manufactured in illicit labs, primarily in China and Mexico. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine. A few grains the size of salt crystals can be a lethal dose. This was the poppy's power, distilled to its chemical essence, completely divorced from the plant itself, and it sent overdose deaths into a terrifying new orbit. So our long, dark lullaby concludes here, in the present day, with this dual crisis. The poppy's legacy is a complex tapestry of relief and ruin. It is the Afghan farmer, trapped between the Taliban and the government, for whom the flower is the only hope of feeding his family. It is the pharmaceutical executive whose pursuit of profit created a generation of addicts. It is the suburban parent, grieving a child lost to an overdose that began with a sports injury and a prescription pad. For 5,000 years we have sought to harness the power of this simple flower to capture its gift of blissful oblivion. We have built empires on it, and we have fought wars over it. We have synthesized its magic into pills, and we have refined its essence into powders, yet we have never truly controlled it. After all this time, all this history, all this pain, the poppy continues its quiet, patient harvest, and we are still counting the cost.